Thank you very much, Dr. Park. It's a real pleasure to see you again, and I appreciate your gracious introduction. My name is Nancy Donovan. I'm co-founder with Dr. Clem Bezold of the Public Sector Foresight Network. Dr. Bezold and I created this network in 2012 for government foresight practitioners around the world and those who work with government on foresight. The purpose of our network is to share knowledge on best practices in foresight, methods and tools, and how to effectively communicate information to policy and decision makers. We are honored to speak at the second conference on the future and strategies of Korea. I would like to extend a special thanks to the co-hosts of this event, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, the National Assembly Futures Institute, and the Korea Development Institute. As Dr. Park mentioned, I spoke at the inaugural conference of the National Assembly Futures Institute last September, which was a wonderful meeting. And Dr. Park and another official from the National Assembly Futures Institute spoke at our Foresight Network meeting in recent years as well. We appreciate the opportunity for further collaboration with Korean government agencies. If you could bear with me, I'm going to pull up my slides. Thank you. Okay, I begin this segment on the United States by discussing the US response to COVID-19 in the role of foresight. I define this as government looking towards the future and taking action to capitalize on opportunities or to avoid risks which can be catastrophic in their consequences. In 2020, we are all too familiar with the human toll of lives taken during a pandemic and the economic and social consequences for our countries and society. In discussing the United States and COVID, I will cover the following topics: the COVID health crisis in America, some economic indicators of its impact, a brief overview of strategy, organization, and foresight, and the promise of a new presidential administration and what lies ahead. Before I discuss 2020, America's first experience with a global pandemic came over 100 years ago with the 1918 pandemic, when an influenza virus swept the globe. The virus infected roughly 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population, and caused 50 million deaths worldwide. In the United States, about 675,000 deaths occurred. It was towards the end of World War I, and the president at that time, Woodrow Wilson, was preoccupied with the war. He was later viewed by historians as downplaying the pandemic. The presence of the virus was first identified in military personnel in the spring of 1918 and then spread to the general population. Eventually, the pandemic ended, but meanwhile had taken a terrible toll. Over 100 years later, the United States is faced with another global pandemic, what has become known as COVID-19. As of December 3rd, there are 13,882,249 total cases, with 196,227 new cases in the last 7 days. There have also been 2,762 new deaths this past week, bringing the US total to 272,525 total deaths. The data shown on this slide shows a significant increase from a week ago, our Thanksgiving holiday in the United States. Public health experts advise the American public not to travel, but many Americans decided to ignore this advice. I would also like to highlight this map of the United States, which shows average daily cases per 100,000 reported by each of our 50 states in the last 7 days. While there was an early outbreak in Seattle, Washington, the epicenter of the pandemic quickly shifted to the East Coast, to New York City. The toll taken was tragic, especially for vulnerable populations, such as our older citizens in nursing homes, African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans. This map currently indicates that in contrast to earlier this year when COVID-19 hit cities on each coast, now a high number of cases are being seen in states shaded in dark blue, which are in the upper Midwest and the mountain states. How does the United States compare with other countries? Data just released and analyzed by Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Research Center describes new cases of COVID-19 in most affected countries. It is part of an analysis of whether countries have been successful in flattening the curve, that is, able to slow the spread of the virus through social distancing and other measures. As you can see, the United States is in a very difficult situation with over 196,000 confirmed new cases. Some countries seen in this image are experiencing greater success. Others are seeing rises in the number of daily confirmed cases. Now, how has the United States handled the coronavirus pandemic since early 2020? Well, the first case was reported in January of this year when a man in his 30s who had traveled to Wuhan in China was diagnosed with novel coronavirus in the state of Washington. On January 29th, a White House coronavirus task force was established. On March 27th, the President signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act after its passage by Congress. This was an economic relief package of over $2 trillion. This also included initial funding for Operation Warp Speed, with the federal government working with and supporting pharmaceutical companies in the development of vaccines. Despite these initiatives, there has been no overarching strategy or national coordination of efforts to support states and local governments in managing their response to the pandemic. As a result, America's national response has rested to a large extent on the decisions of individual states and local governments, such as cities. This has resulted in difficult issues, such as the ongoing controversy over mask wearing. There has been inconsistent and politicized messaging at the White House and by others. For many in the US, wearing a mask represents a threat to individual freedom rather than a necessary public health measure. Other issues throughout the year have included inadequate testing capability and the continuing shortage of personal protective equipment. This slide shows a list compiled by the US Food and Drug Administration in August of this year related to shortages in personal protective equipment known as PPEs, testing supplies, as well as ventilation-related products, which states and other organizations continue to voice concerns about. In a national survey done by the US Government Accountability Office, 1/3 to 1/2 of states and territories reported ongoing shortages of some testing-related and other medical supplies. Most states reported certain PPE supplies remained scarce, and about 1/3 of respondents were greatly or completely concerned about having enough supplies to administer vaccines in the future. In addition to the health impact of lives lost and continuing medical problems for those who are called the long haulers, the economic toll of the pandemic in the United States has been very difficult. There have been a variety of economic indicators which can be used to evaluate the economic impact of COVID-19. I would like to highlight some recent data from a major report issued within the last week by the US Government Accountability Office, otherwise known as GAO. This slide indicates the percentage change of employment by sector from February through October of 2020. While the overall labor market has improved since May, this data highlights that net losses in employment are substantial compared with February for sectors such as the leisure and hospitality industry. For this sector, employment has decreased by 21% during a 9-month period. The recent GAO also discussed another indicator, the number of unemployed workers permanently losing jobs and on temporary layoff from January 2019 through October 2020. While the economy has improved since July, many people remain unemployed, including both those temporarily laid off and those who have permanently lost their jobs. The number of those permanently losing their jobs increased from 2 million in April 2020 to 3.7 million in October 2020. While workers on temporary layoff can expect to return to work, the increase in unemployed workers with permanent job losses could indicate the following: more lasting economic disruption and greater difficulty returning to the labor market. In reviewing academic studies, the GAO report also suggests the pandemic is likely to remain a significant obstacle to more robust economic activity. Now, what led up to 2020 in terms of initiatives related to pandemic strategy and planning in the United States? When the Bush administration, a national strategy for pandemic influenza was released in 2005. In 2006, the Obama administration created a Directorate for Global Health and Security and Biodefense at the National Security Council. This administration also updated in 2015 the earlier National Strategy for Pandemic Influenza. The Trump administration, however, disbanded the National Security Council Directorate in 2018. In terms of foresight, the 2020 pandemic was not a black swan, an unexpected but highly significant event. In a list of selected examples, the 1997 Millennium Project predicted disease bringing life as we know it to a grinding halt. In terms of other examples, Johns Hopkins has run pandemic simulations from 2001 to 2019. In 2009, a Red Death scenario was generated by the National Project on Security Reform. 10 years later, a Crimson Contagion pandemic simulation was conducted by the US Department of Health and Human Services. A full accounting of the history of strategy, planning, and the role of foresight still needs to be written, but the major points are that efforts have been made in the past to focus on strategy and organizational structure, as well as foresight to better plan for the future. I'd like to next give some examples of the use of futures-related tools and foresight during 2020. This slide shows the results of a publication in April 2020 by the University of Minnesota of 3 scenarios regarding possible pandemic waves. All 3 scenarios highlight the importance of risk communication messaging given the possibility of periodic resurgence of the disease over the next 2 years. The recommendation was made when this came out in April to plan for the worst case scenario, assuming no vaccine availability or herd immunity. We are now in this period, the fall peak, as described by scenario 2. And Dr. Michael Osterholm, who worked on developing these scenarios, anticipates what he called in the last week, a dark winter ahead for the United States. A recently published US foresight study by the Millennium Project, commissioned by the Red Cross, takes a holistic view in developing scenarios for 2022, considering medical and health issues, social well-being, and economics. This study concludes that the greatest health, financial, economic, and psychological impacts lie ahead, and notes the importance of public actions and that a vaccine is not a panacea. And perhaps most significantly of all, the Millennium Project notes that a whole of nation strategy with responsible public behavior, strategic leadership, and international coordination can dramatically improve the US situation. We now have a new president-elect, Joe Biden, who served as vice president in the Obama administration. It is noteworthy that in his campaign with Senator Kamala Harris, who ran for vice president, a plan to combat COVID-19 and prepare for future global health threats was issued. The plan is very detailed with many recommendations, but I'd like to note some of the general principles enunciated by the plan. These include restoring trust, credibility, and common purpose, and rallying the world to confront this crisis while laying a foundation for the future. As a first order of business, President-elect Joe Biden established a COVID task force on November 9th, 2020, a week after the American election, and appointed major experts in the healthcare area to this task force. In announcing its establishment, President-elect Biden stated that dealing with the coronavirus is one of the most important battles our administration will face, and I will be informed by science and by experts. Given our use of Zoom in this particular time, if you look at this image of the first meeting that was held by President-elect Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris, who is Vice President-elect. All of the experts are on an enormous screen. And of course, there is appropriate distancing between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. In the time ahead, pressing decisions continue related to COVID-19, including vaccine allocation. Despite these immediate challenges, I believe that the advent of a new administration with its stated commitment to evidence and science will pose a special opportunity for foresight in the United States. And I would like to emphasize the collaboration and knowledge sharing among foresight networks and practitioners is essential. While COVID-19 has taken a tragic toll and made our lives so difficult, an unexpected benefit has been the use of technologies for meetings such as this one, enabling dialogue among foresight practitioners from around the world. In the recent months, Duncan Cass-Beggs, who will be speaking to the conference in the next few hours, ran a wonderful meeting for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on foresight. And many of us remarked on how the number of us who were able to attend would not have been possible under usual circumstances. I want to thank you for your attention. And if you would like more information, please contact me at this email. Thank you.